At the Mother's Day lunch, my son's wife handed me a frozen meal. "You can eat later. This is just for family." I went home alone. 3 days later, she received a letter from my lawyer. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I should have known something was wrong the moment Isla opened the door. Not because of her forced smile. I'd grown used to those over the years, but because of the way she positioned herself in the doorway, blocking my view inside like a bouncer at an exclusive club. "Helen," she said, her voice saccharine sweet in that way that always made my stomach tighten. "You're right on time." I held up the bouquet of peonies I'd brought, Zachary's favorite flower since he was a boy. "Happy Mother's Day, dear. These are for the table." Isla didn't move to take them. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, and I heard the sound of laughter and conversation drifting from what should have been my family gathering. Multiple voices. More people than I'd expected. "About that," Isla said, still blocking the entrance. "There's been a slight change of plans." I felt my chest tighten. That familiar sensation I'd learned to recognize whenever Isla was about to deliver one of her carefully crafted disappointments. "What kind of change?" She stepped aside just enough for me to see into the dining room. My dining room. In the house I'd bought for them 5 years ago when they couldn't qualify for a mortgage. The table was full. Every single chair occupied by people I didn't recognize. Young couples, probably Isla's friends from her book club or yoga class. All dressed in their Sunday best. All laughing at something someone had said. "We invited a few friends," Isla said, watching my face carefully. "You understand how it is. We don't get to entertain much with our busy schedules." I stood there holding those peonies, feeling suddenly foolish in my best dress. The navy blue one with the pearl buttons that Zachary used to say made me look elegant. "Where am I supposed to sit?" Isla's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Well, that's the thing. We're completely full up in here." She gestured toward the kitchen. "But don't worry. I've prepared something special for you." She led me through the house I knew by heart, past the living room where I'd helped them arrange furniture, past the hallway where my grandson's baby photos should have been but had mysteriously disappeared over the months. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator and pulled out a plastic container. "The kind you'd pack for a lunch break at work." "It's the same meal," she said, setting it on the counter with a decisive thunk. "Just more convenient this way. You can eat it whenever you're ready, without all the fuss of a formal dinner." I stared at the frozen container, condensation already forming on its surface. Through the doorway, I could see Zachary at the head of the table. The seat that used to be mine when this was still my house, before I'd signed it over to help them get established. He was carving what looked like a beautiful roast, probably the same recipe I taught Isla years ago when she claimed she wanted to learn my family traditions. "Zachary," I called out, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. He looked up, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his face. But then one of Isla's friends said something that made the whole table burst into laughter, and he turned back to them, smiling and nodding as if I hadn't spoken at all. "He's busy hosting," Isla said, her voice gentle now, almost pitying. "You understand how it is. This is really more of an intimate gathering for our close friends. Family time can be so overwhelming sometimes." The word hit me like a physical blow. Family. As if I wasn't family. As if I was some distant relative who'd overstayed her welcome instead of the woman who'd given birth to the man currently entertaining a table full of strangers in the house I'd bought him. "I see," I managed to say, though my throat felt like it was closing. "I suppose I should have called first." "Oh, Helen." Isla reached out and patted my arm. A gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. "You're always welcome, of course. It's just that sometimes it's better to keep things simple, you know? Less complicated." I looked again toward the dining room, where everyone was now seated and passing dishes around the table. Beautiful dishes, my grandmother's china. The set I'd given them as a housewarming gift. They were using it for their friends while serving me a frozen meal in a plastic container. "I think I'll just head home," I said, setting the peonies on the counter next to the container. "Are you sure? You could stay and eat in here. I could put on some music, make it nice for you." The offer was worse than the original slight. She was actually suggesting I sit alone in the kitchen like hired help while they celebrated in the room where I should have been the guest of honor. No, thank you. I picked up my purse, checking to make sure my car keys were still inside. Please tell Zachary I said goodbye. Of course, Isla said, already moving toward the dining room. Drive safely, Helen. And thank you for understanding. Understanding. As if this was all perfectly reasonable. As if it made perfect sense for a mother to be excluded from her own son's Mother's Day celebration. I walked to my car on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. Behind me, I could hear the laughter continuing louder now, as if my departure had somehow freed them to really enjoy themselves. It wasn't until I was driving down the street that the tears came. Not just tears of hurt, but tears of recognition. This hadn't been a last-minute change of plans. This had been deliberate. Calculated. Isla had planned this entire scenario, down to the frozen meal and the table full of friends, to send me a message about where I stood in their lives. The message was clear. I was no longer family. I was an obligation, a burden to be managed with plastic containers and kitchen tables. But as I drove home to my empty apartment, something else began to stir beneath the hurt and humiliation. A memory, sharp and clear, of the day I'd signed those papers transferring the deed to Zachary's name. I'd been so proud, so happy to help my son and his new wife start their life together. I'd forgotten something important that day. Something I was just now beginning to remember. That house wasn't just their home. It was still legally and morally mine. I spent that Mother's Day evening sitting in my small apartment, staring at the frozen meal I'd brought home and never bothered to heat up. The silence felt different than usual. Not peaceful but hollow. Like something vital had been carved out of my life, and I was just now noticing the empty space it left behind. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark. No call from Zachary. No text checking if I'd made it home safely. Nothing. I found myself walking through my apartment, really looking at it for the first time in months. When had it become so sparse? When had I stopped buying fresh flowers for the kitchen table or replacing the throw pillows when they got worn? Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped treating this place like a home and started treating it like a waiting room. A place to exist between visits to my real family. But today had made it clear. I didn't have a real family anymore. I had a son who'd forgotten how to stand up for his mother, and a daughter-in-law who'd made an art form out of erasing me from their lives. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chun from next door knocked on my door, holding a plate of her famous ginger cookies and wearing the concerned expression I'd come to associate with bad news. "Helen, dear," she said as I let her in. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how was your Mother's Day? I saw you come back so early on Sunday." I poured us both tea, grateful for the company even if it meant explaining my humiliation. It was different this year. Mrs. Chun studied my face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. Different how? Before I could stop myself, the whole story came pouring out. The table full of strangers, the frozen meal, Zachary's silence, Isla's calculated kindness that felt more like a slap than any outright cruelty would have. "That woman," Mrs. Chun said, shaking her head. "I've never liked her, you know. Too sweet on the surface, too calculating underneath." "You've barely spoken to her," I protested, though without much conviction. "I don't need to speak to her. I've watched her." Mrs. Chun leaned forward, lowering her voice as if Isla might somehow overhear us. "Did you know she's been telling people in the neighborhood that you're difficult?" The teacup trembled in my hands. "What do you mean, difficult?" "Last month at the grocery store, I overheard her talking to that woman who lives on Maple Street, Jennifer something. She was going on about how you're always dropping by uninvited, how you don't respect their privacy as a couple, how hard it is to maintain boundaries with someone who refuses to understand them." Each word felt like a separate blow. "I don't drop by uninvited. I call first." "I know you do. I've seen you sitting in your car before going to their house talking on the phone first." "But that's not the story she's telling." Mrs. Chun reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Helen, honey, she's been preparing people for this. Building a narrative where you're the problem so that when she finally pushes you out completely, everyone will think you had it coming." I sat in stunned silence trying to process this information. All those times I'd felt like conversations stopped when I entered a room, like people were being polite but distant. I'd thought I was being paranoid. Apparently I'd been naive instead. "There's more," Mrs. Chun said gently. Jennifer mentioned that Isla said you've been financially controlling, that you use money to manipulate them. Financially controlling? The words came out as a whisper. I helped them buy that house. I co-signed when they couldn't get approved for the mortgage. I've never asked for a penny back. That's exactly what Jennifer said when I told her what I knew about the situation. She said it sounded more like you'd been incredibly generous, not controlling. After Mrs. Chun left, I found myself pulling out the file folder I kept in my bedroom closet. The one with all the important papers I rarely needed to look at. Birth certificates, insurance policies, my will, and buried beneath everything else the deed transfer documents from 5 years ago. I spread them out on my kitchen table, reading through them carefully for the first time since I'd signed them. The memory of that day came flooding back. Zachary and Isla sitting across from me at the lawyer's office, both of them so grateful, so excited about their future together. Zachary had actually cried when I told them I wanted to help with the down payment. Mom, I can't believe you're doing this for us, he'd said, squeezing my hand. We'll pay you back as soon as we can, I promise. Don't be silly, I'd replied. What's the point of having savings if I can't help my son start his life? But as I read through the legal language now, I realized something I'd forgotten in my eagerness to help them. The deed transfer hadn't been a gift in the traditional sense. It had been structured as a family loan with very specific terms about repayment and, more importantly, about my rights regarding the property. I'd retained what the lawyer had called beneficial interest in the house. At the time, he'd explained it as a way to protect my investment while still allowing them to live there as homeowners. If they defaulted on payments to me, which they'd never made, I now realized, or if certain other conditions weren't met, I could reclaim the property. The conditions were vague, written in legal language I'd barely paid attention to 5 years ago. But one phrase jumped out at me now. Upon material breach of the family agreement as defined in supplemental documentation. I shuffled through the papers, looking for anything that might qualify as supplemental documentation. At the bottom of the stack I found it. A single page I'd completely forgotten about, titled Family Covenant Agreement. It was handwritten in Zachary's careful script, something the lawyer had suggested as a way to clarify everyone's intentions and expectations. I remembered being touched that Zachary had wanted to put his promises in writing. The agreement was simple but specific. In consideration of Helen Morrison's generous assistance with the purchase of our family home, Isla and I commit to maintaining and honoring the family relationships and traditions that have always been central to our lives. We promise to include Helen in all major family celebrations and decisions, to seek her counsel on important matters, and to ensure that our home remains a place where she always feels welcome and valued. It was signed by both Zachary and Isla, dated and witnessed by the lawyer. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding harder with each pass. This wasn't just a sentimental gesture or a meaningless piece of paper. According to the deed transfer documents, this family covenant was legally binding. And Isla's behavior on Mother's Day, deliberate exclusion from a major family celebration, treating me as unwelcome in what had been my own home, was a clear violation of its terms. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the law office that had handled the original transaction. It took 3 transfers before I reached someone who could pull up my file, but when they did, they confirmed what I'd suspected. Yes, Mrs. Morrison, we do still have all your documents on file. The family covenant agreement was indeed designed to be enforceable under the terms of the deed transfer. If you believe there's been a material breach, you have the right to initiate reclamation proceedings. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by legal papers and the growing realization that I had more power in this situation than I'd ever imagined. For 5 years I'd been grateful for their tolerance, apologetic for my presence, careful not to overstep boundaries that I'd never agreed to in the first place. I'd allowed myself to be slowly erased from my son's life, one small humiliation at a time, because I thought that was the price of staying connected to him. But I'd been wrong. I hadn't given them a house out of the goodness of my heart with no strings attached. I'd made an investment in our family relationship, with clear terms about how I expected to be treated in return. Terms that Isla had been systematically violating for years, while I stood by and let it happen. Not anymore. Wednesday morning I called Zachary, not to complain or make demands, but to give him one last chance to remember who I was to him before I took the steps I now knew I had every right to take. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. Hey Mom. What's up? I wanted to talk to you about Sunday, I said, keeping my voice steady. There was a pause. Oh, yeah, about that. Listen, I'm sorry if you felt left out, but Isla had already invited her friends before we thought to call you and… Zachary. I interrupted him gently. Do you remember the family covenant you wrote when I helped you buy the house? Another pause, longer this time. The what? The agreement you signed, promising to include me in family celebrations. You wrote it in your own handwriting. Mom, that was 5 years ago. Things change. Relationships evolve. You can't expect everything to stay exactly the same forever. The casualness in his voice, as if he was discussing the weather rather than systematically excluding his mother from his life, hit me harder than Isla's calculated cruelty ever had. At least with her, I could tell myself she was the problem. But this was my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out, reducing our relationship to an inconvenient obligation that needed to evolve. So you think it's reasonable that I was given a frozen meal while strangers sat at the table in the house I bought for you? It's not your house anymore, Mom. His voice was sharper now, defensive. You gave it to us. You can't give someone a gift and then hold it over their heads forever. It wasn't a gift, Zachary. It was an investment in our family relationship. There's a legal difference. What's that supposed to mean? I took a deep breath, still hoping he might hear himself, might recognize what he'd become. It means I expected to remain part of your family when I helped you build your life. Not the most important part, not the center of everything, but part of it. Instead, I've been systematically pushed out while being told I should be grateful for the scraps I'm given. That's not, Mom, you're being dramatic. Isla tries so hard with you, but you make it difficult. You show up with expectations, you want things to be the way they were when I was a kid. But I'm married now. I have my own family to think about. I am your family. You know what I mean. But I did know what he meant, and that was the problem. Somewhere along the way, I'd been reclassified from family to extended family to burden. And my son, the man I'd sacrificed everything to raise, saw nothing wrong with this. Zachary, I said quietly, do you love me? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Of course I love you. You're my mother. When was the last time you acted like it? This time the silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally he spoke, his voice defensive and irritated. I don't have time for this right now, Mom. I'm at work. Can we talk about this later? When? I don't know. Soon. I'll call you. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat holding the phone, staring at the legal documents spread across my kitchen table. The conversation had answered the question I'd been afraid to ask. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a phase. This was a choice. Zachary had chosen Isla's version of family over mine, and he saw nothing wrong with it. Thursday afternoon, I made an appointment with the lawyer who'd handled the original deed transfer. James Patterson was in his 60s now, silver-haired and kind, with the sort of gentle manner that probably served him well in family law. Mrs. Morrison, he said, reviewing the file I'd brought. I remember this case. You were incredibly generous with your son and daughter-in-law. Too generous, it seems. He looked up from the documents, studying my face. What's happened? I told him about Sunday, about the years of gradual exclusion, about Zachary's casual dismissal of our family covenant. With each detail, his expression grew more serious. This is a clear material breach, he said finally. The family covenant was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Your son and daughter-in-law have failed to honor their commitments under the agreement. What are my options? Well, you have several. The deed transfer was conditional upon their compliance with the family covenant. Since they violated those conditions, you have the right to reclaim the property. We could start with a formal notice of breach, giving them 30 days to remedy the situation. And if they don't, then we proceed with reclamation. The house would revert to your ownership. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness wash over me. Relief that I wasn't powerless, that I had legal recourse. Sadness that it had come to this at all. There is one thing you should consider, Mr. Patterson said gently. This will likely destroy your relationship with your son permanently. Are you prepared for that possibility? My relationship with my son is already destroyed. I said. I just didn't want to admit it to myself. He nodded slowly. Then let's draft that notice of breach. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked myself a proper dinner. Not something microwaved or grabbed on the way home from errands, but a real meal with multiple courses and my good china. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, though I couldn't remember what occasion I'd originally been saving it for. As I ate, I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago. Eager to help, eager to please, so grateful that my son wanted me involved in his life that I'd signed away my own home without a second thought. That woman had believed that love meant never setting boundaries, never making demands, never expecting reciprocity. She'd been wrong. Love wasn't just giving until there was nothing left to give. Love was also expecting to be treated with basic respect and dignity. Love was recognizing when someone was taking advantage of your generosity and having the strength to say no. I'd spent 5 years accepting less and less from Zachary while giving more and more, telling myself that this was what good mothers did. But all I'd accomplished was teaching him that my feelings didn't matter, that my presence was optional, that he could treat me however he wanted without consequences. Well, he was about to learn otherwise. After dinner, I pulled out a pad of paper and began writing a letter. Not the legal notice, which Mr. Patterson would handle, but a personal letter to my son. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't vindictive or impulsive. This was the natural consequence of choices he'd made over years. Dear Zachary, I wrote, by the time you read this, you'll have received formal notice that I'm reclaiming the house. I want you to know that this decision didn't come from anger, though I am angry. It came from self-respect, which I realize I lost somewhere along the way. I gave you that house because I believed we were building something together. A family that would include all of us. A future where I would always have a place at your table. In your life, in your heart. Instead, I've watched you and Isla systematically erase me from your world while taking everything I offered. This ends now. I won't beg for your love anymore. I won't accept scraps and call them blessings. I won't pretend that being treated as an inconvenience is the same as being treated as family. The house was always mine, Zachary. I just forgot that for a while. But I remember now, and I'm taking back what belongs to me. Not just the house, but my dignity, my self-worth, and my right to be treated as someone who matters. I love you. I will always love you. But I won't let you use that love to diminish me anymore. I sealed the letter in an envelope, addressing it to Zachary at his office. He could read it before or after he got the legal notice. It didn't matter to me which came first. What mattered was that for the first time in 5 years, I was remembering who I used to be before I started accepting the unacceptable. And she was someone worth fighting for. The legal notice was delivered on a Friday morning at exactly 9:17 a.m. I know this because Mr. Patterson called me the moment the courier confirmed delivery. It's done, Mrs. Morrison, he said. They have 7 days to respond to the breach notice, and 30 days to either comply with the original covenant terms or vacate the property. Thank you, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. I'd expected anxiety, second thoughts, maybe even regret. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, certainty. The phone started ringing at 10:45 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. Then I let the second call go to voicemail. And the third. By lunchtime, I had 12 missed calls from Zachary and 6 from Isla. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I went to the grocery store and bought ingredients for pot roast, my grandmother's recipe, the one I'd taught Zachary's wife before she decided my traditions weren't worth preserving. I spent the afternoon cooking, really cooking, for the first time in months. The smell filled my apartment with something that had been missing. The feeling of home. The doorbell rang at 6:30 p.m., sharp and insistent. Through the peephole I could see Zachary pacing on my doorstep, running his hands through his hair the way he'd done as a child when he was upset. Behind him, Isla stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Mom, Zachary began, his voice tight with stress. We need to talk about this. Do we? I asked. Because 3 days ago, you told me you didn't have time to talk. This is different. This is... He held up the legal papers. This is insane. You can't just take our house away. It's not your house, Zachary. It never was. I let you live in my house under specific conditions, which you've chosen to violate. Isla stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. This is vindictive and cruel, Helen. All because of one dinner party that didn't go the way you wanted. One dinner party? I looked at her carefully, noting the way she was dressed, designer jeans, expensive jewelry, the kind of casual outfit that probably cost more than most people spent on formal wear. All paid for, I realized, by the money they'd saved by not paying me back for the house. Isla, this isn't about one dinner party. This is about 5 years of being systematically excluded from my son's life, while you both benefited from my generosity. We never asked you to buy us that house, she shot back. No, you didn't ask. You just took it. And then spent 5 years making sure I understood that accepting my help didn't mean you owed me basic respect. Zachary stepped between us, his face flushed with frustration. Mom, please. Can we just sit down and talk about this like adults? There has to be a way to work this out. For a moment, looking at my son's distressed face, I almost wavered. This was still the boy I'd rocked to sleep when he had nightmares, the teenager I'd stayed up with when he was heartbroken over his first girlfriend, the young man who'd cried on my shoulder when he thought he'd never find someone to love him. But then I remembered Sunday. The frozen meal. The table full of strangers. The casual way he dismissed my hurt feelings. Come in, I said, stepping aside. They followed me into my small living room, both of them looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. And maybe they were. When was the last time either of them had actually been inside my apartment? Sit, I said, gesturing to the couch. I took the chair across from them, the one that gave me the best view of both their faces. Mom, Zachary began again, leaning forward with his hands clasped. I know you're upset about Sunday and I get it. Maybe we could have handled things better. But taking our house away? That's not proportional to. Stop, I said quietly. Stop calling it your house. It was never your house. And stop minimizing what happened Sunday as if it was an isolated incident. I got up and retrieved the file folder I'd been keeping on the kitchen counter, the one with all the documentation Mr. Patterson had helped me organize. Years of evidence I'd been unconsciously collecting without realizing it. Let me tell you what's been happening, I said, opening the folder. 2 years ago, you uninvited me from Zachary's birthday dinner because Isla's mother was visiting, and she thought it would be too crowded with both mothers there. Zachary's face went pale, but he didn't deny it. Last Christmas I was told I could come for dessert only, after the real celebration was over, because you wanted to establish new traditions with just the two of you. Mom, I'm not finished. I pulled out another document. This is a copy of the invitation list for your anniversary party last year. 37 people including Isla's book club friends, her yoga instructor, and 3 couples you'd never mentioned to me before. But somehow there wasn't room for your mother. Isla shifted uncomfortably, but her expression remained defiant. We can't invite everyone to everything, Helen. Parties have size limits. You're right, I agreed. They do. But somehow, Zachary's mother never seems to make the cut. I pulled out the family covenant agreement, the one Zachary had signed in his own handwriting. Do you remember writing this? He glanced at the paper, then away. That was a long time ago. 5 years. And in those 5 years, have you honored even one part of this agreement? Have you included me in major family decisions? Have you sought my counsel on important matters? Have you ensured that your home remains a place where I feel welcome and valued? The silence that followed was answer enough. You know what the saddest part is? I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. I would have given you that house anyway. If you just asked me honestly, told me you needed help, I would have signed those papers without any conditions at all. But you didn't just want my money, Zachary. You wanted my gratitude for being allowed to give it to you. That's not, he started, but I held up my hand. Every time I was excluded, every time I was made to feel like an inconvenience, every time Isla made it clear that I was barely tolerated in my own son's life, you stood by and let it happen. And when I tried to talk to you about it, you told me I was being dramatic, that I needed to understand that you had your own family now. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't wipe them away. I am your family, Zachary. Or I was, until you decided I wasn't worth defending. Isla leaned forward, her voice taking on that syrupy tone I'd learned to dread. Helen, I think you're misunderstanding our intentions. We never meant to make you feel excluded. Sometimes family dynamics are just complicated. No, I said firmly. What's complicated is figuring out how to uninvite your mother-in-law from Mother's Day dinner without looking like a complete monster. What's complicated is excluding someone from family celebrations while continuing to live in the house they bought for you. What's complicated is maintaining the illusion that you're grateful for someone's help while systematically erasing them from your life. I stood up, suddenly feeling tired in my bones. You have 30 days to decide what matters more to you. Keeping the house or keeping your word. Because you can't have both anymore. Zachary stood too, reaching out toward me. Mom, please. Don't do this. We can fix things. We can make them better. How? I asked. Are you going to uninvite Isla's friends from future family gatherings so there's room for me? Are you going to start defending me when she makes her little comments about how I don't understand boundaries? Are you going to remember that I'm your mother, not some distant relative you have to manage? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because we both knew the answer. I didn't think so, I said softly. Isla stood abruptly, her composure finally completely shattered. This is emotional blackmail, Helen. You're trying to manipulate us into giving you what you want by threatening to take away our home. No, Isla, I replied calmly. This is consequences. For the first time in 5 years, your actions have consequences. And apparently you don't like how that feels. They left without another word. Isla's heels clicking angrily on the hallway floor. Zachary trailing behind her with slumped shoulders and the defeated posture of a man who'd finally run out of ways to avoid choosing sides. After they were gone, I sat back down in my chair and looked around my small apartment. For the first time in years it felt like enough. Like home. My phone buzzed with a text from Zachary. This isn't over, Mom. We'll fight this legally if we have to. I turned off the phone and went to check on my pot roast. It smelled like Sunday dinners from when Zachary was young, when we were actually a family, before I forgot that love should never require you to disappear. The campaign against me began exactly 48 hours after I served them with the legal notice. It started with a phone call from my sister Margaret, who lived 3 states away and hadn't spoken to me in 6 months. Helen, she said without preamble, what in God's name are you doing to that boy? I was watering my plants on the balcony, enjoying the morning sun and the first real peace I'd felt in years. Margaret's sharp tone cut through that peace like a blade. Good morning to you too, Margaret. I assume Zachary called you. Of course he called me. He's beside himself, Helen. He says you're trying to take his house away over some petty family squabble. I set down my watering can and sank into the small patio chair I'd bought myself last spring. Is that what he told you? That this is petty? He said you were upset about a Mother's Day dinner that didn't go the way you expected. And now you're using some old legal document to punish him and Isla. I closed my eyes, feeling suddenly exhausted. Of course that's how he'd framed it. Not 5 years of systematic exclusion, not the violation of a written agreement he'd signed, not the casual dismissal of my feelings and my place in his life. Just a mother overreacting to one disappointing dinner. Margaret, did he tell you about the family covenant he signed when I bought them that house? He mentioned some old paperwork, but Helen, you can't hold people to every little thing they signed years ago. People change, situations change. You have to be flexible. Flexible. I repeated the word, tasting its bitterness. Like when I was flexible about being uninvited from his birthday dinner. Or when I was flexible about being excluded from their anniversary party. Or when I was flexible about eating a frozen meal in the kitchen while strangers sat at my table. There was a pause. He didn't mention those things. No, I'm sure he didn't. But Margaret wasn't easily swayed. Even so, Helen, taking someone's house away? That's extreme. That's vindictive. What would Mother think if she were alive to see this? The mention of our mother, who had never let anyone treat her with disrespect, who had taught us that dignity was something you claimed for yourself because no one else would give it to you, made me laugh. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Mother would ask why I waited so long to stand up for myself. The calls continued throughout the week. Zachary's college roommate, who I'd hosted for countless holidays when the boys were young. My cousin Linda, who'd always liked Zachary better than her own son. Even Mrs. Patterson from down the street, who barely knew me but had apparently been recruited to the cause. Each conversation followed the same pattern. They'd been contacted by either Zachary or Isla, given a carefully edited version of events, and asked to talk sense into Helen. None of them had heard about the years of exclusion, the broken promises, the systematic erosion of my place in my son's life. All they knew was that a mother was threatening to take away her son's home over a dinner party. By Thursday, I was screening all my calls. But Friday brought a visitor I couldn't avoid. Pastor Williams from the church I'd attended sporadically over the years stood at my door. His kind face creased with concern. He was holding a covered dish that smelled like Martha Williams' legendary cornbread. "Helen," he said gently, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in the neighborhood, and Martha thought you might enjoy some fresh cornbread." I knew this wasn't a social call, but Pastor Williams had married Zachary and Isla, had baptized me 40 years ago, had been there when my husband left and I was struggling to raise a son alone. If anyone deserved a hearing, it was him. "Come in," I said, leading him to the living room. "Can I make you some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." As I prepared the coffee, I could feel him studying my apartment, taking in the neat but sparse furnishing, the lack of family photos that had once cluttered every surface. When I returned with the tray, he was holding the framed picture of Zachary's graduation, the last photo we'd taken together where both of us looked genuinely happy. "He was so proud that day," Pastor Williams said softly. "Kept talking about how you'd sacrificed so much to put him through school. That feels like a lifetime ago." He set the photo down carefully. "Helen, I want you to know that I'm not here to take sides or tell you what to do, but I am concerned about you, about your family." I poured the coffee, buying myself time to formulate a response. "What did they tell you?" "Zachary came to see me earlier this week. He's troubled. He says you're trying to take their house away because of a misunderstanding at a family dinner." "Is that all he said?" Pastor Williams studied my face carefully. "He said you felt excluded from their Mother's Day celebration, and that you're using a legal technicality to force them out of their home. He's worried that you're not thinking clearly, that you're acting out of hurt rather than wisdom." I nodded slowly. "And what do you think?" "I think," he said carefully, "that there are usually two sides to every story. And I think that the Helen Morrison I've known for 20 years wouldn't threaten to take away her son's home, unless something was seriously wrong." For the first time in days, I felt like someone was actually listening to me rather than just trying to manage me. The relief was almost overwhelming. "Pastor Williams," I said quietly, "can I tell you what really happened?" He nodded, settling back in his chair with his coffee cup. "I'd like that very much." I told him everything. Not just about Mother's Day but about the years leading up to it. The gradual exclusion from family events, the broken promises, the way Isla had systematically erased me from their lives while I stood by and let it happen because I thought that's what love required. I showed him the family covenant. Let him read Zachary's handwritten promises. I showed him the legal documents that proved the house had always been mine, that I'd never given it away without conditions. When I finished, Pastor Williams sat in silence for several minutes, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Helen," he said finally, "how long has this been going on?" "Years. But it got worse after they got married. I think Isla saw me as competition for Zachary's attention." "And you never said anything?" "Never fought back." I laughed bitterly. I tried. Every time I brought up feeling excluded, Zachary would tell me I was being too sensitive, that I needed to understand that he had his own family now. Eventually, I stopped trying. And now I'm tired of disappearing to make other people comfortable. Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "You know, Helen, there's a difference between Christian forgiveness and allowing yourself to be mistreated. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting behavior that diminishes your worth as a person. Try telling that to my sister. Or Zachary's college friends. Or half the people in this town, apparently. People react to change, especially when it challenges their assumptions about who they think you are. You've been the accommodating mother, the one who gives and gives without asking for anything in return. Now you're setting boundaries, and that makes people uncomfortable." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But Helen, you need to ask yourself, are you doing this because you want to punish Zachary? Or because you want to reclaim your dignity?" It was a fair question, one I'd been wrestling with myself. I don't want to punish him. I want him to understand that his actions have consequences. That you can't treat someone the way he's treated me and expect them to just keep accepting it. And if he doesn't understand? If this ruins your relationship permanently? I felt tears prick at my eyes, but my voice remained steady. Pastor Williams, our relationship was already ruined. I just didn't want to admit it to myself. He stayed for another hour talking about forgiveness and dignity, about the difference between turning the other cheek and enabling bad behavior. When he left, he squeezed my hand and said something that stayed with me. Helen, I've watched you sacrifice for that boy his entire life. Maybe it's time you taught him that some things are worth fighting for. Saturday brought my first real ally. Mrs. Chun knocked on my door carrying a plate of dumplings and wearing an expression of barely contained outrage. Helen, she said, bustling past me into the apartment, I have had it up to here with that daughter-in-law of yours. What happened? She came to my house yesterday. Actually rang my doorbell and introduced herself, can you believe it? Said she wanted to clarify some things about your situation. I felt my stomach clench. What did she say? Oh, she was very sweet about it. Very concerned. Said you were going through a difficult time, making some poor decisions, and that she hoped the neighbors would be understanding when you came to your senses and apologize for the trouble you'd caused. She said that. Word for word. She actually suggested that we might want to gently encourage you to reconsider your rash actions before you damaged your relationship with your son permanently. Mrs. Chun set the dumplings on my kitchen counter with more force than necessary. That girl thinks she's very clever, doesn't she? Building a narrative where you're the unstable one. And she's the long-suffering daughter-in-law, just trying to hold the family together. It's working, I said quietly. Half the people I know think I've lost my mind. Well, the other half think it's about time you stood up for yourself. I looked at her in surprise. Really? Helen, do you think we're all blind? Do you think we haven't noticed how that woman treats you? The way she talks about you when you're not around? The way your own son acts like he's doing you a favor by acknowledging your existence. Mrs. Chun pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. That Jennifer woman from Maple Street? The one Isla was gossiping to at the grocery store? She called me after Isla's little visit yesterday. Wanted to know if what Isla said was true. If you were really being vindictive and unreasonable. What did you tell her? I told her to mind her own business. But then I also told her about all the times I've watched you sit in your car outside their house, clearly working up the courage to knock on the door of what used to be your own home. About how you always call before going over there. How you bring gifts and flowers and get treated like an unwelcome stranger. Mrs. Chen's eyes blazed with indignation. I told her about the time I saw you crying in your car after one of their dinner parties. The one you weren't invited to even though you could hear the laughter from the street. I felt my throat tighten. You saw that. I see a lot, Helen. And what I see is a woman who gave everything to her son, and got nothing but disrespect in return. Jennifer sees it too. Now that she's thinking about it instead of just listening to Isla's version of events. She reached across the table and took my hand. You're not alone in this, Helen. There are people who know what kind of person you really are, and what kind of person she is. Don't let them make you think otherwise. That evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, my phone rang. For once, it wasn't someone calling to convince me I was wrong. It was Jennifer from Maple Street. Helen, she said, her voice tentative. I owe you an apology. The 30 days passed more quickly than I'd expected. Not because I was anxious for them to end, but because for the first time in years, I was actually living my life instead of just waiting for permission to be part of someone else's. I'd taken up painting again. Something I'd loved in college but abandoned when Zachary was born, and I needed to focus on more practical matters. I joined a book club at the library, started taking evening walks through downtown, even signed up for a cooking class focused on international cuisine. Small things, but they felt revolutionary after years of organizing my life around other people's schedules and needs. Zachary called twice during those 30 days. Both conversations were brief and painful. The first call came on day 15. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Mom, we've been to see 3 different lawyers. They all say the same thing. That what you're doing is legal but unconscionable. And what did you tell them? I asked calmly. I told them about the family covenant, about how you're holding us to some impossible standard based on a document we signed 5 years ago. Impossible standard, I repeated. Like including your mother in family celebrations? It's not that simple and you know it. Actually, Zachary, it is exactly that simple. You promised to treat me as family. You broke that promise. Now there are consequences. He hung up on me. The second call came on day 27, and this time his anger had been replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. Mom, please. We'll lose everything if you go through with this. The house, our equity, our credit rating. Everything we've built together. What about what I built, Zachary? What about the mother-son relationship I spent 35 years nurturing, only to watch you let your wife tear it apart piece by piece? We can fix this. We can make things better between us. How? There was a long pause. I don't know yet, but we can figure it out. Just don't take our house away. It's not your house. It never was. And you can't fix 5 years of damage with promises you don't intend to keep. What do you want from me? His voice cracked, and for a moment he sounded like the little boy he'd once been. I want you to remember that I'm your mother. I want you to act like it matters to you whether I live or die. I want you to defend me when your wife treats me like garbage. And I want you to include me in your life because you love me. Not because you feel obligated. I do love you. Then prove it. But prove it with actions, not words. Words are all you've given me for 5 years, and they haven't been worth much. He didn't call again. On day 31, I woke up to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was my key, the spare I'd given them years ago, and a short note in Zachary's handwriting. Mom, we're moving out today. Isla found us a rental across town. I hope you're happy with what you've accomplished. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had led to this moment. No recognition that his actions had consequences. Just accusation and resentment, as if I'd done something to him rather than simply stopped allowing him to do things to me. I got dressed and drove to the house, my house. For the first time in over a month, the moving truck was parked in the driveway, and I could see boxes stacked on the front porch. Zachary and 2 men I didn't recognize were loading furniture while Isla supervised from the lawn, directing them with sharp, precise gestures. I parked across the street and watched. I felt strangely detached from the scene, as if I were observing someone else's life rather than my own. This should have been devastating, watching my son pack up his life and leave because of a choice I'd made. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. Isla spotted me first. She said something to Zachary, who looked up and saw my car. For a moment we stared at each other across the distance. Then he turned away and went back to loading boxes. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there until the truck was full and they were ready to leave. As they pulled away, Zachary driving the moving truck, Isla following in her car, neither of them looked back at me. The house stood empty, waiting for me to reclaim it. I used my key for the first time in 5 years. The rooms felt strange at first, familiar but foreign. They'd painted over the soft yellow walls I'd chosen, replacing them with stark white and bold accent colors that felt cold and impersonal. The hardwood floors I'd lovingly restored were scratched and scuffed. My grandmother's built-in shelves had been painted over, hiding the beautiful wood grain I'd spent months bringing back to life. But it was still my house. The bones of it, the foundation, the memories embedded in every room. Those were still mine. I walked through each room slowly, taking inventory of what needed to be undone, what needed to be restored. In the master bedroom, I found something that made me stop and catch my breath. A small hole in the wall where they'd removed something, leaving behind the faint outline of a picture frame. It was where I'd hung a family photo of the 3 of us from Zachary's high school graduation. I'd forgotten I'd left it behind when I moved out, forgotten that it had watched over them for 5 years while they slowly erased me from their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinets and found them mostly empty. They'd taken the everyday dishes but left behind my grandmother's china, the set I'd given them as a housewarming gift. It was still beautiful, still precious, but clearly not precious enough to take to their new life. I spent the rest of the day walking through my house, reacquainting myself with the home I'd almost forgotten was mine. As evening fell, I ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by the echoes of my old life and the possibility of a new one. 3 months later, the house looked like mine again. I'd restored the original paint colors, refinished the scratched floors, and filled the rooms with furniture that reflected my taste, rather than someone else's idea of what a home should look like. I'd also made changes that were entirely new. The spare bedroom became an art studio where I could paint without worrying about making a mess. The formal dining room became a library, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a comfortable reading chair by the window. The backyard became a garden where I grew vegetables and flowers without having to ask anyone's permission. I was having coffee in my new library on a Tuesday morning when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Zachary standing on my front porch alone. He looked thinner than I remembered and tired. His hair needed cutting, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. But what struck me most was his posture. The defeated slump of someone who'd finally run out of options. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Hello, Zachary." "Hi, Mom." His voice was hoarse, uncertain. "Can we talk?" I studied his face, looking for signs of the anger and resentment that had colored our last conversations. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse. "Are you here to apologize or to try to convince me to give you the house back?" He winced. "To apologize. Just to apologize." I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in my new library, surrounded by books and the morning light streaming through clean windows. Zachary looked around the room, taking in the changes I'd made. "It looks different," he said quietly. "It looks like mine," I replied. He nodded, understanding. "Mom, I came to tell you that you were right. About everything." I waited, saying nothing. "Isla and we're getting divorced." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for weeks. It turns out that when there's no one left to blame for our problems, we had to start looking at ourselves. And what we found wasn't pretty. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I'd never wanted his marriage to fail. "Are you?" He looked at me searchingly. "I thought you'd be happy that Isla was out of my life. I wanted her to treat me with respect, Zachary. I never wanted her gone. There's a difference." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "She admitted it, you know, about the campaign to push you out. She said she felt like she was competing with you for my attention, so she made sure you didn't get any. And you let her." "I let her," he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. I told myself I was keeping the peace, avoiding drama. But really I was just taking the easy way out. It was easier to let you be hurt than to deal with her being angry. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside I could hear birds in the garden I'd planted. The sound of life returning to places that had been empty for too long. "Mom," Zachary said finally, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I destroyed something precious, and I may never be able to rebuild it. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did to you, to us. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears were streaming down his face now, and I felt my own eyes well up in response. This was my son. Not the man who'd stood by while his wife humiliated me. Not the person who dismissed my pain as drama, but the boy I'd raised and loved and never stopped hoping would find his way back to me. "Zachary," I said gently, "I forgive you." He looked up, startled. "Just like that?" "Not just like that. It took months of you experiencing consequences before you were ready to see the truth. It took losing your marriage and your house and probably some friendships before you were willing to look at your own behavior. But yes, I forgive you." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean going back to the way things were. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be different this time." "Different how?" "Different in that you remember I'm your mother. Not just when it's convenient for you. Different in that you defend me when someone treats me badly, even if that someone is important to you. Different in that you include me in your life because you want me there. Not because you feel guilty if you don't." He nodded slowly. "I can do that. I want to do that." "We'll see," I said, but not unkindly. "Trust is rebuilt slowly, Zachary. With actions, not words." He stayed for 2 hours. We talked about his divorce, his new apartment, his job, his plans for the future. For the first time in years, we talked like family. Not like a mother and son going through the motions, but like two people who genuinely cared about each other. When he left, he hugged me goodbye. A real hug, not the perfunctory embrace we'd exchanged for years. "Mom," he said as he reached his car, "would it be okay if I called you this weekend?" Maybe we could have lunch. I'd like that, I said. But call first. Don't just assume I'm available. He smiled a real smile, the first one I'd seen from him in years. I'll call first. I watched him drive away, then went back inside my house. My home. The place where I'd learned that sometimes love means setting boundaries, and sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them experience the consequences of their choices. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat in my library, surrounded by books and possibility. Outside, my garden grew wild and beautiful, tended by hands that had remembered how to nurture themselves as well as others. For the first time in 5 years, I was exactly where I belonged.